So as Adam mentioned, the name of my book is An End to Upside Down Thinking. The subtitle is Dispelling the Myth That the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. The book has been endorsed by a number of scientists that I've listed here. Eben Alexander, who's a former Harvard neurosurgeon, Dr. Irvin Laszlo, who's a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and a number of other researchers from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Princeton University, and other places. So when I tell people about my book, usually they ask, so are you a scientist or a philosopher? Like, what's your deal? And I say, I'm neither. I'm actually a businessman. So as Adam mentioned, I'm a partner at a firm called Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley, and we advise technology and innovation companies on business strategy and mergers and acquisitions. Prior to that, I was with UBS in New York doing investment banking, and my first day of work was July of 2008. I was there until 2010, so through all the crisis. I could probably write another book just on that period, but today we're not going to talk about it.
That one has no hope.
No, it doesn't. And prior to that, I studied at Princeton, where I was captain of the tennis team, so I was very busy with that. I wanted to study astrophysics, but I didn't have time because of tennis. So I studied psychology and behavioral economics. So I had always had big questions, but it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I first became interested. Is anyone curious as to the story about how I...
Yes.
Okay. I'll do that for a bit, and then we have a lot of content to get into. So it was about 2 years ago, August of 2016, when I heard a podcast randomly that it was a woman talking about being able to communicate with non-physical entities. And I was like, that's interesting. I've never heard of that before. And it led me to listen to other podcasts that were somewhat similar. And as I listened to more and more podcasts and started to do a bit of reading, I wasn't convinced about anything at all, but I was just intrigued that many people were independently saying the same things about reality. They were saying that we all have innate psychic abilities. They were saying that when our bodies die, our consciousness doesn't die. And they were talking about some kind of interconnectedness between things that we couldn't see. So I was intrigued enough to continue down the path, and eventually I got to the point where there was enough evidence on this new side that I couldn't reconcile my old worldview. So I became obsessed, and all I did was research. I would go to work and research nonstop, because I realized the reality that I thought was true wasn't. So I needed to figure out what the actual reality was so I could figure out how to live my life. So that's what I did. So I spent a year basically doing nonstop research. And at first, I didn't want to tell anybody about it because the ideas were so outlandish. I mean, in the business world, the athletic world, I wasn't going to talk about psychics. But eventually, once I got my fact base together, I realized that there was a lucid argument that could be made, and I started to tell different friends about it. And the responses I got were that people's lives were starting to shift, that they were looking at their own lives differently in a more positive way. And the more they thought about our conversations, the more things were improving for them. So it was July 4th weekend, 2017. I said, okay, I'm on to something here. Why don't I just try putting it on paper? Before then, I had no intention of ever writing a book or being public with anything, so that changed. So July 4th weekend was a 4-day weekend that year. So I just stayed in my apartment for 4 days straight, and I ended up writing more than half the book. And then over the next few weekends, I finished the book, and all of a sudden I had this book. So I've been telling some people about that here, and like Adam gives me a hard time, like, you wrote your book in a month? But for me, that's just how I do things. I was so passionate about it that I wanted to get it out on paper. And that is the book that is coming out on October 9th. And it's being published by Waterside Press. So when I mentioned my old worldview, I now know my old worldview has a name. It's called materialism. Is anyone familiar with materialism? Okay. Is anyone not familiar with it? I wasn't familiar with this term, but basically what materialism says is that the universe is fundamentally made of matter, physical stuff that you can touch. There was some event 13.8 billion years ago that we call a Big Bang that filled the universe with matter. And when you have matter in this big universe, you end up with interactions between that matter. We call that chemistry. When you have enough random chemical interactions between these particles, you end up with a self-replicating molecule. Chance tells us that will happen eventually. So on Earth, that's DNA. DNA leads to the evolution of a human being and other organisms. The human being develops a brain, and then consciousness pops out. Consciousness comes from the brain. And when I say consciousness, I mean the mind or awareness, the subjective inner experience that we have. So when I say I am up here speaking, the I that I identify myself with, that's consciousness. This leads to a very bleak worldview. And I understood what this worldview was even before I got into this. If consciousness comes from the brain, then what happens when the brain dies? Consciousness dies. No brain, no consciousness. So when the body dies, it's over. No memories. Anything that happened during life is wiped out. And I know it's a bleak and nihilistic way to think about things, but that's what's implied by materialism. And this is what our mainstream science is teaching. Whether explicitly or not, this is what we're taught, is that consciousness comes from the brain, it comes from matter. What I didn't realize was that there are some serious problems with materialism until I got into my research. And many of the problems are at the top of the triangle, around this idea that consciousness comes from the brain. Science magazine has actually called this the number 2 question that remains in all of science. As they phrase it, what is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, how does biology produce consciousness? We don't know the answer. It has a special name. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. So to illustrate that, I'd like everyone to please touch your arm. Thank you. Now please touch your leg. Thank you. Now please touch your mind. You just illustrated the hard problem of consciousness. Our consciousness is not physical, but our body is. We can touch our body, we can't touch this awareness that we have. How does that happen? How does something physical produce a non-physical? We don't know the answer. So why is it that we assume that the brain produces consciousness? Why has materialism persisted? There are actually a number of reasons to hypothesize that consciousness could come from the brain. One is that our sensory organs are all located near our brain. So eyes, nose, ears, mouth, all up here. It feels like our consciousness is up here. But if you did a thought experiment and imagined that those same organs were at your shins, where would it feel like your consciousness is? It's something to think about. But even beyond that, there are some scientific reasons to guess that consciousness comes from the brain. And the reasons are that we know there's a strong correlation between what happens in our brain and the type of conscious experience we have. You stimulate the visual cortex, the person has a change in vision. Someone gets in a car accident, they have memory issues. There's a correlation between brain states and conscious states. So isn't that it? Can't we just conclude the brain produces consciousness? We can't. There's a potential logical fallacy that I think most of science is making, which is to assume that because two things are related, one must cause the other. In statistics, it's correlation does not imply causation. So what's an example of that? If you imagine there's a large fire, many firefighters show up. A larger fire, more firefighters show up. How many of you think that the firefighters caused the fire? There's a strong correlation between the presence and the number of firefighters and the size of the fire, but there's not a causal relationship. So is it possible that we're making the same mistake with consciousness? Is there an alternative perspective on the brain that would still allow the correlations that we see? And a way to think about it is to view the brain more like an antenna receiver, or more precisely like a filtering mechanism for a consciousness that is not localized to or produced by the body. Then we would also see strong correlations between what happens in the brain and what happens to our conscious experience. It's like we're viewing a limited perspective of a broader reality, and the brain is the filtering mechanism with which we view it. There's also some science, there's a whole chapter on this in An End to Upside Down Thinking, on the idea that we see reduced brain functioning associated with enriched conscious experience. This happens with psychedelics, this happens with near-death experiences, it happens with savants who have incredible abilities but damaged brains, and that would match this idea that the brain is filtering consciousness. So when we damage the brain in certain ways, we reduce the filter and are exposed to this broader reality. So what's an alternative to materialism? In An End to Upside Down Thinking, which you might now understand the name of the book based on where consciousness is located in this alternative, I argue that consciousness isn't at the top of the triangle, but rather it's primary and exists beyond space and time, and it is a unified entity of which we're all a part. Quantum physics points in this direction. It doesn't necessarily prove it, but we know from the observer effect in quantum physics that just by observing a physical particle, its behavior changes. So it suggests that something might be going on with consciousness. And on the topic of interconnectedness, we know from quantum entanglement that there are invisible connections between particles that we can't see with our eyes. Einstein hated this. He called it spooky action at a distance, but it's been proven over and over again. So we're seeing that the fabric of reality has these properties that kind of align with this idea that consciousness isn't from the brain. And even the early quantum physicist, Max Planck, who's a Nobel Prize winner, in 1931, he recognized what was going on, and he said, I regard consciousness as fundamental, and I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. And that's exactly what I'm suggesting in the book. an analogy to think about from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup is to think of all of reality as like a stream of water, where water represents consciousness. And each of us is like an individual whirlpool. I'm one whirlpool, you're another whirlpool, you're another whirlpool. We have our localized, individuated experiences, but we're all part of the same stream. So what happens if my whirlpool opens up a little bit and allows in water from another whirlpool? That would be like telepathy, someone else's consciousness entering my mind, like psychic abilities. So this model would predict that psychic abilities are real. It would also predict that we survive bodily death, because when the whirlpool stops being a whirlpool, the water dissipates into the broader stream. It doesn't leave the stream, it just transitions states. So when we talk about mediumship, and Thomas John's talk was amazing today, it makes complete sense under this framework that the consciousness of a deceased person hasn't left the stream, it's just accessible in a different way. The majority of an N2 Upside Down thinking explores the scientific evidence for psychic phenomena and survival of bodily death. Each of the bullets is its own chapter on all the scientific evidence that exists for these different areas. And what I reason is that if any one of these is actually real, not even all of them, if one is real, we can't explain it by materialism. But we can explain it very well by this idea that consciousness is primary. So I'll go through these very quickly. We don't have that much time, and I want to leave some time for questions. Psychic phenomena, remote viewing. So this is the ability to see things with your mind at a distance. So you're not even there physically and you're able to see it. Clairvoyance. I'll actually show you some documents from the US government stating that this is real. Telepathy. This is mind-to-mind communication. The classic study is known as the Ganzfeld Experiment, where you have Bob in a room in a relaxed state listening to relaxed music. And you have Jane in another room, and Jane is shown a picture by the experimenters. And the experimenters say, Jane, I want you to mentally send what you're seeing to Bob in the other room. And she says, okay, fine. I'll act like I'm sending it to him. These are normal people. These are not talented psychics. And then Bob comes out of his relaxed state, and he's shown 4 pictures. He's asked to choose which one Jane was sending mentally. You would expect that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, 25%. What do we get over decades of studies when you do a meta-analysis and combine the results? Closer to 32%. From a statistical standpoint, this is massive. Something's going on. But from our own everyday experience, this actually makes a lot of sense. Because if I were 100% telepathic all the time, I would be reading your thoughts right now. But instead, it's more subtle, where I think of somebody and then I get a text. I think of them, then they email or call. So the effects are subtle in many of these cases, and the same goes for the next one, precognition, which is knowing the future before it happens. And I'd mentioned that under this theory, consciousness is beyond space and time. Precognition is where consciousness is sort of reaching forward into the future. And actually, there's evidence that it reaches backwards sometimes too. There's evidence that the body responds to stimuli or pictures that are arousing before it's known that the picture will be shown. And again, the effects are statistical but very small. Psychokinesis is the ability for the mind to affect physical matter. A number of studies on this, but there's a classic study using random number generators. So these are machines that spit out zeros and ones in a random fashion. So you get 50% zeros, 50% ones. People in these experiments, and some of these were run at Princeton by the former dean of engineering. While I was there, had no idea about it. This was totally underground because it was so controversial. You ask people to put their mind to the machine and make it produce more zeros than ones, or more ones than zeros. What happens? You get a slight deviation from chance. It's very small but highly statistically significant, meaning that the mind is somehow exerting some effect on this machine. So it suggests that the mind is affecting matter. Again, if consciousness is the basis of reality, this isn't paranormal. It's actually what you'd expect. So these 4 areas, they have achieved 6 sigma statistical results. Is anyone familiar with 6 sigma? Okay, for those who are not familiar with 6 sigma, which I wasn't until I got into this. It means the odds that these things are happening just by chance, if you combine all the studies that have been, some of which are in peer-reviewed journals, the odds that these are happening by chance are more than 1 billion to 1. So in any other area of science, we accept those things as being real, and there's that much evidence already. Survival of bodily death. I would love to go into these in more detail, but I will not have time. The near-death experience is an incredibly important phenomenon that needs to be studied more, but these are cases where people are clinically dead in some cases or have extreme impairments to their brain, and yet they have lucid memories, some of which are verified as being accurate. You had one? Lucid memories that are verified as being accurate during the time that their brain is off. So there's a consciousness that seems to be existing independently of a functioning brain or body. We can't explain that by conventional brain mechanisms. We shouldn't have such lucid experiences when there's little or no brain functioning, and yet it's happening. Communications with the deceased, this is like mediumship. There actually have been studies done on this. The Windbridge Research Center has 2 peer-reviewed journal studies under quintuple blind situations where the medium's on the phone and just knows the first name of the deceased person and is able to give non-chance information about that person. So we need more research on it, but it's emerging, in addition to the very talented people like we heard this morning and others throughout history. Children who remember previous lives, I'm referring to studies done at the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies, for more than 50 years, over 2,500 children who have memories of a life that's not theirs. And in some cases, the researchers are able to find a person that matches the description that the child gives. It is very difficult to explain using conventional means, and this is the University of Virginia. I mean, it's serious stuff, and they've been doing this for a while. So I will go through very quickly some of the evidence for remote viewing. I tried to pick the things that were most visual. The US government ran a 25-year program on remote viewing and other psychic abilities. They were using psychic spies for national security. Recently, they declassified the documents. So when I heard about this, I said, okay, I'm going to check out the CIA's website. Found this document. It's in an End to Upside Down Thinking as well. They define remote viewing very clearly, which is the ability to see things with the mind alone at a distance. And Jimmy Carter confirmed that they used this to find a Russian-downed bomber in Africa. They used remote viewers to find it. This is what the document says. Remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Pretty explicit. This is not even going into any of the other studies that Princeton ran or other people. I mean, is that compelling?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought so too. A science panel looked at this, including scientists from Caltech and other very legit places. What did they find? Implications are revolutionary, evidence too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence. This is pretty powerful. This is suggesting that people are able to access distant locations with their mind. Again, not paranormal if consciousness is beyond space and time. You're just accessing another part of the stream. Only paranormal under materialism. Back to the topic of children with past life memories. What I didn't mention is that in some cases, the children have birthmarks or physical deformities that match how they describe dying in the previous life. So this is an example from Dr. Ian Stevenson's book from the University of Virginia. A little girl who described dying in a very gruesome way in a previous life where she was tied up in ropes and tortured. And she said, "Grandpa, look at what they did to me, how cruel they were." This is the natural shape of her leg in real life. She's taking on physical characteristics of a person who died, and the researchers did find a person that died in the exact manner that the girl describes. So there are cases like this that cannot be explained by materialism. If we consider consciousness to be like this infinite stream, then it's very conceivable that you could recycle water from one whirlpool to another, and somehow characteristics get transferred from one to another. Again, it's at least conceivable under this new framework. So you might be asking something that I've asked over and over again. If there's so much evidence for this, how is it possible that it hasn't been accepted yet? You've got 6 sigma results in 4 different areas. You have all these other crazy things, Princeton, UVA. What I found, and what others have found, is that there is a resistance to looking at these things and even talking about them. And I think one of the reasons that I can do this is that I'm not an academic. Many of the academics that I've talked to said that they waited until they got tenure to look into these things. No joke. One researcher told me, this is a cognitive neuroscientist, she studies precognition, which is knowing the future before it happens. And she was at a preeminent university. She was told, because she had these studies on her resume, that she should take it off her resume if she wanted to progress in the organization. So this is the dynamic that we're seeing, and I profile it in an End to Upside Down Thinking because I think it's a serious problem that is holding back science and further the evolution of the planet. This is a quotation from Dr. Jessica Utz. So she was commissioned by the CIA and Congress in 1995 to look at these studies that were using psychic spies from the documents you saw. She concluded, and she's a statistics expert, using the standards applied to any other area of science, psychic phenomena have been well established. And this is a publicly available report. Very explicit again. So she's saying what's going on. what she finds is that the debunkers actually haven't looked at the evidence at all. They haven't even read the papers because it's impossible, or it challenges the worldviews of those in power in academia, or people don't want to have to admit that they were wrong about something. Lots of factors at work. What we have going on right now is very similar, eerily similar, to what happened with Galileo. There were clergymen that didn't want to look in his telescope to see the evidence. So this is one of the reasons I wrote An End to Upside Down Thinking, is to give the general public a peek in the telescope, because this is critical stuff. So this is a weekend about disruption. Is this disruptive enough?
Yeah.
So Dr. Eben Alexander was kind enough to offer an endorsement to my book. So I used a quote because it relates to the disruptive nature of what I'm talking about. He says, well, this notion, which he agrees with, will make the Copernican revolution seem relatively minor. This, to me, is the biggest revolution in human history, because if we think about Copernicus and our position relative to the sun, that's still external. If we think about Earth isn't flat, that's external. This is redefining what it means to be a human being. If we think about materialism, it says that we are a body that has a consciousness. This alternative unified reality, consciousness is primary paradigm, says that I'm a consciousness first and foremost, experiencing the physical world through a body. So this was a radical change for me, if you can imagine, because I was totally in the materialist camp. What are the implications? This changes everything for basically every topic we can think of. Science and medicine are currently not incorporating consciousness, or the majority of science and medicine are not incorporating consciousness. So if you think about our equations that regard consciousness as a zero because it has no effect on the physical world, what would happen if consciousness had an effect on those equations? Who knows what kinds of technological developments we could see? Artificial intelligence. We've heard a lot about that this weekend. I have a slightly different perspective than what I hear from Elon Musk and others. I think artificial intelligence is very dangerous because human beings can create machines to do harm to others. But can we create a conscious machine? Can we create consciousness from matter? Can we create a machine that has feelings? Under this idea, no, we can't create it. So artificial intelligence is dangerous, but we need to think about the origin of consciousness in thinking about the extent of the danger. Treatment of life and death. I mean, how do we think about our own lives on a daily basis if we don't actually die when our bodies die? That changes things. I know for this room that idea is not so outlandish, but in the communities that I've come from, that's a crazy idea. That's like out there. But to me, the biggest implication for this gets to Daniel Schmachtenberger's talk yesterday. He basically said that we're on a spiral downward, and I agree with him. And he said that the reason at its core, at least the way I understood it, was that we have a belief in separation. That because we're fundamentally separate, all these other things happen that are detrimental to society, and that we need to correct that thinking. So my whole book is the science leading to the idea that we're not actually separate. And we're finally at the point in history where we have enough science to get the scientific community, hopefully, behind this. So this is a massive idea, not only for interpersonal relationships, but this is potentially for the survival of the species. If we continue to think that we're fundamentally separate, then we have our own personal interests. But if I think that my consciousness is fundamentally the same as yours, even though we have an appearance of separation, it becomes irrational to harm someone else. It's actually irrational. If you think about altruism, which is a topic in evolutionary biology that's caused people problems sometimes, trying to understand, well, how is it that we want to help each other if it's survival of the fittest? People have theories. If we think about it from this standpoint, altruism is actually a form of selfishness. You want to help others because you're helping yourself, because you're part of the same consciousness. So this recontextualizes some very major things. And to me, if there's one message to leave you with, it's that all of these implications, to me, come back to this idea that consciousness doesn't come from the brain. The faulty assumption that we're hearing throughout most of our society in the civilized world from science, that consciousness comes from the brain, leads to many of the problems that we see today, if not all. So that's why, another reason I decided I needed to write An End to Upside Down Thinking, to end the upside down thinking, and to get us on a track that is in line with reality. Woo. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
glad you're taking questions. Thank you. And whoever else. Check.
So I have 3.5 minutes.
So, okay. So, how do you see, with all that you've studied, and you also can, as you're studying, you're seeing even where the resistances are, or maybe what the resistance or why the resistances are there. How can we translate this idea to permeate so it doesn't threaten religion? You know, how can we position or translate it so they can hear that? Because the thing is, if we could put it into their languaging, it can line up in some way, don't you think, to translate? Okay.
The way
I want to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. So the way I think about it is that the mystical traditions of basically every religion all point to this.
Yeah.
They all say the same thing about a unified consciousness. So that gives people who have an affiliation something to hang on to. I think that's the best way to do it. However, it will challenge beliefs that people have. So I think it's unavoidable.
Yep. Hi, great talk. Have you looked at the research about hydroencephalax? There was a student at Princeton who actually graduated, and the doctors found out that 90% of his brain matter had been destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah, and then they did some later research with mice, and they found out if you destroy the brain really slowly, the mice don't realize it, and they just they still filter through the consciousness. Is that in the book?
Yeah. Yes. So there's a book called Shuffle Brain, in which the researchers shuffled animal brains and put them back into the animals. These are elementary animals like salamanders or rats, and they still exhibit certain routines and behaviors. So this goes back to the idea that we can damage the brain, but the conscious experience is there, and sometimes it's enriched, which aligns with this idea that the brain is more like a filter of consciousness rather than the producer.
Are you looking at Hammerock's work?
Or, yes. I can't say I fully understand it and how it fits in. I don't think many people understand it, but the idea is that, that in the brain there are microtubules that have quantum properties that interact with consciousness. And Roger Penrose is the co-author on this idea, and he worked with Stephen Hawking on black hole theories. So it's a physicist entering the realm of consciousness, which on its own is significant. I don't know if the theory is still controversial, but it's talked about a lot. One more?
Once I heard that sometimes we put things on paper because it helps us understand what's actually happening in our mind. Is it possible that the internet is such an example and that is what is connecting us already?
I think it's contributing to it.
Contributing?
It's definitely contributing. And it certainly makes information accessible. I was able to do this so quickly, in part because of free information. I could listen to podcasts, I could go online, I could go to the CIA's website and download those documents.
Question would be, is that already there though? Is the internet already existing between us? Is that where consciousness lives? And we created it to see it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not how I've thought about the internet traditionally. I've thought of the internet as still something material, that's part of the material world, but it's still an experience through which consciousness is experiencing things. Betty.
If consciousness is at the, so if consciousness is in everything, then consciousness is in materiality, so it's not separate.
Mm-hmm. Right, it's a very non-dual perspective, which is where I come out to, that the material is an experience within consciousness.
Yes, okay.
All right.
Woo, all right.
Thank you very much.
All right.